Okay, so today we are looking at PFT 101, which is essential and fitness assessments. Day one, which is going to be PowerPoint 1, and that's going to be NASM chapter 2. Okay, so this is going to be primarily out of your first NASM PowerPoint here. We're not doing multiple PowerPoints in this class of day, actually. So you know what? Since we're not, yeah, I can keep this kind of simple. I don't have to put PowerPoint. Let me just go day one, NASM chapter 2. Okay. 24, hold, zoom out to 70%. All right. Center it, bullet, nope. And bullet point it. Okay. Now we're all set up. So as we go through it here, oh, I forgot, hold on. One little thing. NASM loves to do this in their slides. As much as I love NASM, I actually hate their PowerPoints, their traditional PowerPoints, just because they always put the timed rehearsal thing in there, and I need to turn that off or I will go crazy. Slideshow. Is it animations? I don't think it's actually animations. It is animations, I was wrong. Delete all of these, no animations play. Just give me all of the text every time. Sorry you guys have to wait on this, but trust me, it's worth it. Okay. Save so that I don't have to deal with that again. I will remember to do it before class tomorrow. Okay. Yes, all the text. Okay, so purpose of this PowerPoint, what we're going over today, we want to be able to understand the fundamental concepts of the kinetic chain, right? So we are back to talking about the kinetic chain here. We're going to talk about our human movement system, right? So that is going to be the nervous system, the skeletal system, and your muscular system. So by understanding those basic anatomic structures, that'll give us a little bit of a better overview and foundation for talking about how we actually move around, right? So we're going to understand the structure and the function today. So after this presentation, we're going to be able to explain the structure and the function of the nervous system and the skeletal system. We'll get to muscular tomorrow. And then we're going to understand like how those respond and adapt to exercise. So we are going to see a lot of this information. You guys, for those of you who are first modders, and I guess that's just you, Maggie, for those of you who are first modders who might be watching or anything, you guys have heard me say a million times that Sochi is very circular and we will come back to certain concepts multiple times. This is your first time seeing that. So we are definitely getting a little bit of the same information out, but we are going to look at it a little bit differently in terms of our perspective. In the last class in kinesiology, we were really looking at a lot of like structure, right? In this class, we're going to look a little bit more at function, like what's so wrong with having rounded shoulders? Like, why was that such a big deal? Well, again, we got to understand that like if function follows form, your bones were designed to sit and rest in a certain position so that they can have like a full range of motion. If you round your shoulders, you don't have that full range of motion, right? You're not going to be able to open up your arm all the way it was designed. And so we need to be able to like observe that posture in our clients. We need to be able to look at that posture and sort of, see if there's any dysfunction. when we have to be able to train our eye to be able to spot that. So that's, in order to be able to do that, we need to know what the resting posture looks like, and that's why we are sort of back to this first initial overview here. So those systems obviously work together. Again, it's called the kinetic chain for a reason. If one link of that chain is out of whack, it's going to affect the other links, right? If your nervous system cannot effectively control your muscular system, then your muscular system is just going to kind of pull any which way. That will move your skeletal system, and now the whole thing is out of whack. Your skeletal system can't move properly, which means your muscular system can't control it the way it wants to, and your nervous system has to find a new way to get the job done. So, you know, it goes in all different directions there. So all components must work together to produce sound movement. If one is not working, it will affect the others. So again, let's go ahead and define really quickly the kinetic chain here, right? This is more commonly known as the human movement system. It is 3 interdependent systems responsible for creating and manipulating human movements. That's not even close. Manipulating. So this is our system that's responsible for us actually moving around. You know, like, it's not like our digestive system isn't important, right? That's an incredibly important system. That's a series of organs that work together to extract energy from food. Your cardiorespiratory system is incredibly important. That's responsible for extracting energy from oxygen and supplying it throughout the whole body. Lots of really important systems, but the kinetic chain is the one that actually like moves us around the world, you know, which is sort of the main thing that we humans do. So 3 systems here. Like we mentioned, it is going to be, I'm going to go ahead and get these out of the way before we move forward, but it's going to be the nervous system, which is responsible for creating a communication network throughout the body. Thoroughwort. That's not what I want to say. Good Lord. Throughout the body, the muscular system, which is responsible for creating internal tension in order to manipulate the skeletal system and create human movement. And it is under the control of the nervous system. And then we've got the skeletal system, which provides a framework for the body, protecting delicate structures and allowing for the muscular system to have a series of levers to manipulate. So, all right, so you get your nervous system, right? That is providing the communication network throughout the whole body. That's gathering information and then executing information in response to whatever information it gathered. You know, that's controlling your muscular system, and your muscular system is actually like manipulating your body around, right? That's actually creating all your human movement. But it wouldn't be able to move anything if it didn't have like a lever to actually move, right? Like if it didn't have anything to grab onto and pull, it wouldn't be able to move. It would just be kind of this squishy sack of like, you know, quivering muscle. So instead we have our skeletal system, which allows us to have this big framework, and that is what is moved by our muscular system, which is again, in a full circle here, under the control of our nervous system. So first one we're gonna look at here today, we're gonna go ahead and look at the nervous system. Right, so your nervous system contains specialized cells that transmit and coordinate signals, again, providing a communication network in the body, right? So your nervous system, if we need to label it out in order for us to be able to understand it, we're going to divide this into two primary sections. You're going to have your central nervous system, which is going to be the comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, this is sort of the command center of the nervous system. We'll put that in quotes, actually, command center of the nervous system. So when you think of your brain and your spinal cord, that's your conscious, you have control over it thought, right? This is the, like I said, the command center. This is where you are consciously making most of your decisions. However, there are some decisions that you don't get to make that are involuntary responses. And that needs to be carried out by the other half of our nervous system, which is going to be the peripheral nervous system. So your central nervous system is sort of the center, right? Like this is your brain and your spinal cord. That's sort of the main section that's most centered to us. Then we've got the peripheral nervous system, which is going to be comprised of these peripheral nerves throughout the body. So when you think of like your central nervous system, right? Do I get a picture here? I think I got a picture coming up. I don't. Central nervous system. So if you look at your central nervous system, right, it is this section right here. It's literally what they've got labeled out. Okay, hold on. It's this purple section, right? The brain and the spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system branches out from that spinal cord throughout the entire body, right? It provides this communication from all of these different areas throughout your body, you know? Like look at your palm, for instance. What are you supposed to do? Here's a question from like, I don't know, 5th grade fire safety or whatever, when the fire department would show up and do an assembly. What are you supposed to do if your house is potentially on fire with your doorknob? Anybody remember?
I forgot. All I remember is stop, drop, and roll.
Well, hey, I'm not exactly qualified to teach about fire safety. I'm trying to use this as a weird example. You're supposed to like just reach out and feel it, right? Feel the doorknob before you try to open it to make sure that there's not like a fire on the other side, right? At least that's what I remember hearing, over and over again. And they would always say like do it with like the back of your hand. And I remember being like asking my teachers like, why the back of the hand? And they were like, because it's less sensitive than the palm of your hand. And you do actually have a lot of sensory neurons in the palms of our hand. Like our hands are pretty tough, but at the same time, like this is so sensitive compared to like other parts of our body. Like, like I've definitely like cut myself plenty of times on like the palm of my hand. And it's the worst because it's like, God, I can feel everything, I'm actually, dude, let me tell you, I was opening a new can of coffee like 3 days ago, and I sliced my finger on the foil like peel back thing, and I was just like, I lost. I was like, like I'm like crying. I couldn't stop like feeling it. Like I'd be sitting at the computer like working like an hour later, and I go, like, just remembering that. There's nothing worse than like a paper cut. Like those are the worst types of cuts. They're so small and centralized, and they're just awkward feeling. So anyway, these are very sensitive. There's a lot of nerve endings in here. So, you can see like where this branches out, but that nerve endings, what they all eventually do, no matter what nerves you're talking about throughout your body, eventually they're going to travel all the way back up, and they're going to junction with your central nervous system. Then that information is going to travel up to your brain, and your brain is going to interpret that information. Like my brain was traumatized when I cut my freaking finger with that foil because it just felt so awkward. And I just like throughout the rest of the day, every time I would like, touch I'm thinking about it right now and I'm getting goosebumps because it's just like, oh, it's such a nasty feeling. I would have, I would have rather been stabbed because at least that would be it'd be more painful, but less awkward feeling. So that's like that's just like parts of my brain firing, in remembrance of this sort of weird feeling. So your peripheral nervous system, your peripheral nerves, right? So this is really, the sensory and this is the sensory portion of the nervous system responsible for gathering information about the internal / external environment, right? So like it is also, like that was an example of like, the stretch receptors and the nociceptors in my finger were responsible for being like, we got a breach, right? And then like that traveled up to my nervous system. My nervous system was like, well, we're probably bleeding. Like it sensed the information, took it to my brain, and my brain ran that information against like previous experiences in order to like execute the appropriate response, which at the time was like, rip the hand away and go get a Band-Aid. But at the same time, there's also internal information as well. Like that's all external information, right? Like I tore my skin, right? But internal information, like for instance, like involuntary responses. Let's say like you eat like a hamburger, and that all travels into your stomach, and your stomach is for this, kind of stretchy sac with some muscle inside that's responsible for like, churning food around and stuff, and making sure that everything gets a nice solid acid bath, Now, obviously, once that soupy mixture, once that's really broken down into like a soupy mixture, it's gooey enough to be ready for like absorption, right? We don't want to just digest things forever. Your stomach doesn't actually get any of the food into your bloodstream. You need to get it to your small intestine in order for it to actually be able to be absorbed. So how the heck do we trigger, the movement of like that wet soupy mixture from the stomach into the small intestine? How do we actually trigger that to happen? Well, there's stretch receptors. And but at the same time, like we don't want like solid chunks to try to go into our digestive system. If a solid full-on chunk tries to move into your small intestine, it's too large to be broken down. Your body can't extract nutrients from it because it's so large. Your body can only extract nutrients from things that have been broken down into, beyond microscopic. I mean, like very, very, very small. So if you swallowed a burger and then your body didn't digest it and it just stays looking kind of like a burger, it's not ready to move into your small intestine yet. So you have these stretch receptors that are there, and they're sensitive to like how much pressure is being put. That's when that knows to go, well, this is a nice wet soupy mixture. That's all broken down very small. Great. And then it opens up your small intestine and allows food to actually travel in through this little like duct. And that's your nervous system. That's your autonomic nervous system at work, right? Which is part of your peripheral nervous system there. So that's your internal environment, right? Information's being gathered. You may not necessarily be thinking about it. Like none of us in here can go, all right, I'm done breaking down breakfast. Go ahead. And then like we can't open up our small intestine. That's something that we have no control over. But it is still part of our peripheral nervous system. It is sensory information being gathered, and then it's under the control of our brain. So let's go ahead and talk about like how our nervous system functions, right? So actually, I'm going to modify this note just slightly. I apologize. Divisions of our nervous system here, and then functions. There we go. So let's look at how our nervous system actually functions, right? So again, it's providing a communication network through our body and allows us to gather internal information and external information. Then, we're also really good at storing information. Like we all have memory. Some of it's automatic, some of it is conscious, right? And so we store that information really well. That way, when we gather information, we can run it across the information that we know and, execute the appropriate response, like luckily when I freaking again sliced my finger open, I didn't keep doing it. I didn't like keep sliding that finger. My brain went immediately as soon as the information was like, hey, skin is torn and exposed and now we're bleeding, right? As soon as that information like ran up to my central nervous system, my nervous system was like, pull the hand away, stop moving. Like that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we have like the integrative information is what we call that. That's basically interpreting information. If you've ever touched a hot stove, the first time you did it, you ripped your hand away. Next time you did it, you also ripped your hand away. You didn't just go, oh, that's kind of interesting. That's really hot. That's definitely hurting my hand. Like we don't do stuff like that. Thanks to these three primary functions of our nervous system. So the first one is going to be sensory function, right? And so sensory function is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or external environment, right? So again, like this is gathering information about what's going on. If it's a hot stove, it's sensing that information. If it's a cool like wall, it's sensing that information, right? So this doesn't really have anything to do with how we actually move. Rather, it's just really gathering information, right? We're not really figuring anything out here. But then we will be able to figure out with our next function, which is integrative function. So integrative function, right, is the ability of the nervous system to analyze and interpret the sensory information to allow for proper decision making and producing the appropriate response. So really, like, your sensory information is just gathering data, right? Like if we had this would be a very odd thing to do, but let's say like I brought in like a series of boxes into class, right? And I'm like, okay, there are animals in these boxes, and then like there was like a special hole in the box, and you could reach through that hole and touch that animal in order to figure out what animal it is. Pretty uncomfortable experiment for everyone, because obviously not everybody loves every animal. Now, let's say like in one of them, we got a duck, right? So you reach in there and like feel this feathery, webbed feet, got a bill thing. That's sensory information. You're sensing all of it. You're using your hands to like touch, and then that information is coming back to your brain, and your brain's like, feathers. Okay, birds have feathers. Webbed feet. Okay, ducks have webbed feet. That's got to be a duck, right? Like you'd be running all that information. That's your integrative information, right? And then if you're like, oh, it's scaly, oh, it's very cold, oh, it's got like it doesn't have any leg. Oh, it's a snake, right? Like you'd run all the information against. That's your integrative function, right? The same thing is true whenever you're balancing, right? If I'm standing on one leg and I start to tilt this way, sensory information is going to my brain saying, hey, this muscle is in a sort of shortened position, right? It's kind of being bunched up here. Meanwhile, gravity is pulling kind of heavy on these muscles over here, and then these muscles are also kind of bunching up. So if I start to tilt this way, sensory information is coming up to my brain. And then my brain's going to be like, okay, well, pull this muscle for 7.5 pounds of force. And that is going to be enough to get me back to normal. That's like what we're talking about when we're talking about proprioception, right? It's your body learning how much strength, how many contractions, like what it has to do to get you back to whatever alignment you want to get back to. So the sensory information comes in, the integrative information uses that sensory information to figure out what the right response is, right? When you see a green light, you know to step on the gas. When you see a red light, you know to step on the brake. And then we got to actually execute all that. So if sensory information is going to the brain, now we got to get all that information, like the right response from the brain back to our effector sites, right? And so that's where your motor function comes in. So motor function is the the neuromuscular response to the sensory information. So now, right, like, again, if I'm in this position here and I need to execute 7.5 pounds of force, right, Now my brain's going to actually send the information away to those muscles to contract and get me back to that neutral position. Like once it figures out the response, now it's got to actually execute the response, right? If that light turns green, your brain needs to tell your calf muscles to contract so that you can perform plantar flexion and therefore accelerate the car. Those are sort of our primary functions here. Now, I already kind of touched on it just a little bit when we were talking about our balance here, but that really leads us to talking about one of our most important concepts, which is proprioception, right? So this kind of gets its own section here because it's so important. But if we're looking at proprioception, right, I would argue that this is like the most important thing you're going to learn today. Proprioception is such a key part of understanding like why we as trainers do what we do. But what it is, if we define it is the body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts, right? So it's the body's ability to sense where it is in space, right? You can think of this as it is our spatial awareness, right? If I were to close my eyes, I can walk forward here and place my hands on my mouse and keyboard, you know, and I'm able to do that because like I may have my eyes closed, but I know from the last thing that I saw how far away my desk is, and I know how like much distance I'm covering with each step. Now I'm not that great at it, right? I don't have like a lot of training in walking around with my eyes closed. I didn't go to ninja school, but like, I have a pretty good sense of like how much ground I cover with each step. This is why like when we catch something, we're able to do that, right? Like something's flying our way, we're sort of able to interpret and like how long it's going to take for that object to get to us, and that allows us to figure out like how much muscle and how quickly we need to recruit it to get our hands up and like catch that object, right? That has a lot to do with like proprioception, but also just like how do I know that like my fingers are wiggling right now? A very simple answer to that. When I ask like when I'm trying to explain proprioception to somebody, I'll be like, well, how do you know your body's doing what you tell it to? Like if you put your hand behind your head and you wiggle your fingers, how do you know your fingers are wiggling? And somebody, a lot of times the basic answer is like, because my brain told my fingers to wiggle, I'm telling it to happen, therefore I know it's happening. And I'm like, that's great and all. Like, I think you're right. But at the same time, like, how do you know it's actually getting done? Like, we've all gone to like fast food before and ordered something and be like, I'll take a hamburger with ketchup only, and then like, how do you know you're going to get a hamburger with ketchup only? Because you could get there and get the wrong thing. Like we've all had our orders messed up before. How do you know your fingers are wiggling the way you're telling them to? Well, that's the other half of proprioception. Like, yeah, it's information going out, but it's also information coming back. That's also part of proprioception. It's a circle. It has to be complete in both directions in order for you to have good proprioception. Because what we often have is altered proprioception. And that's pretty much mostly what we're talking about in this course. Not the only thing. We're going to look at performance assessments as well. But when we look at like posture alterations, somebody who has an anterior pelvic tilt, they often have, the reason they have an anterior pelvic tilt is because they have altered proprioception. Talk to somebody who has like a low back arch, they don't feel that low back arch. They feel like that's normal posture. And then when you look at them, it's like your pelvis is tilted towards the floor. Your ASIS is way below your PSIS. And so it's actually tilting this way and you get too much of a low back arch. And they're like, really? That feels like my normal comfortable posture. I feel like I'm standing upright. And it's like, no, actually your skeletal system is designed to sit a little more neutrally like this, right? Or when you talk to somebody who has rounded shoulders, they don't feel those rounded shoulders. That's altered proprioception. And that's why this is such an important concept for us to understand. Now, obviously we can fix a lot of that proprioception by stretching the body out, getting those muscles to relax and getting that person back to a neutral place. And a lot of times when you do that, they'll go, oh my God, that feels so much better. They're like, oh yeah, that dull ache that I feel 24 hours a day is kind of gone a little bit, right? Like they will feel kind of better and they'll feel like it's different. But the body slowly works its way back to that other position because it's gotten used to doing it for so often. And so, you know, stretching and mobility can get our proprioception back to normal, but so can balance training. If you work on that, you know, stretching, and then you challenge the body to stay in alignment through like some type of balance exercise, that might get their brain to realize like what position it's supposed to be in, because balance training is just sending so much information in. It's gathering so much information about its environment. So it becomes really important to train our nervous system in proper movement patterns. Like part of the reason why trainers care so much about good form is because we are trying to develop proper proprioception, and a lot of our clients have altered proprioception. You know, I've got altered proprioception in my pelvis. You know, my hamstrings like to stay contracted all day, and that like tilts my pelvis posteriorly. It likes to tilt it backwards. Just like in somebody who sits all day, they tend to experience like an anterior tilt. Their quadriceps and hip flexors like to stay in a shortened position because they get used to it. So that's really what we're looking at there. So if we're looking at like how we actually move, right? We know that movement is obviously like, you know, if we look at motor function, right? The movement that is in response to our sensory information, right? Again, you touch a hot car, your hand decides to like jerk away. That's a response to whatever information was gathered. So this is why we want to train in like a multi-sensory environment. Training in like an environment that involves lots of information coming in teaches all of the parts of your nervous system to be, you know, active. We don't want to be lazy in one part of our nervous system. We don't want any like one part of our nervous system to not function. I need to see. Sensory information come in and my brain was like, all right, well, we got to explode some air.
Bless you. Bless you.
Yeah, totally. Oh, bless you. That I totally misheard you. I totally misheard you. I thought you said question. Oh my God. All right. Oh boy. That was the sensory information of the vibrations. My brain ran that against things that teachers normally hear. So obviously the most effective way to create long-term change is to use that multi-sensory environment, right? All right, so now we kind of have a pretty good overview of like, you know, really what it is, like why we're spending so much time talking about the nervous system. Let's go ahead and break down some of the basics here. So looking at, you know, the very small, looking at the cells, the main cell we're going to be talking about is the neuron, right? So the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system, right? And basically what that means is the nervous system is made up of billions upon billions of neurons. You have got a whole bunch of them. Now, there are going to be three main parts to this. You're going to have your cell body, which is going to have all the normal features that you see in like a cell. Like normally, like when we're looking at like animal cells, we do this like kind of classic drawing here. I like this one. This is really simple. Here's like a typical like animal cell, right? You know, it's got a nucleus in the center, and you know, it's got mitochondria and, you know, endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatuses and stuff. That's kind of your classic animal cell. Most of your cells don't actually look like this. You know, they have like a form that reflects their function. So if you look at like a neuron cell, you know, they're going to look a little bit different. But this main body here, that's kind of what you want to think of when you think of like the main animal cell. you know, they have this sort of main structural function here. You're going to find all that normal stuff, right? There's your nucleus, there's your endoplasmic reticulum, your Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, all that stuff is going to be found in the normal cell body. But again, one of my favorite concepts that I always come back to is the idea of like function following form, right? Like if something looks a certain way, it's going to act a certain way. So neurons need to be able to provide a communication network, which means they need to be able to connect to other neurons. And so you're going to see these other specialized structures. You're going to see an axon, which is the tail portion of your neuron. I'm going to go back here. So this big long tail that you see here, if I need to be able to connect, you know, neuron over here to a neuron that's like way over there, I need to kind of have an extension cord, right? Like I need to have a long tail that travels the entire way. And so that is the axon of your neuron there. And then I also need to have these special little structures here that are able to like reach out and grip those other neurons. So you're going to see these things called dendrites, right? Which are these little fingers that kind of branch out from the body of the neuron there. And they're really good at attaching to, you know, these little like fibers at the end of the axon, right? Like they're able to kind of link up. And now I can get information to travel from one direction down to the other. It is kind of like a series of extension cords, especially when you consider that like the nervous system uses electrochemical signals. So that's sort of the main section of your neuron there, right? It's going to have billions and billions, right? Now, the three types of neurons that we've got are going to be sensory neurons. And sensory neurons are in charge of the sensory function of our nervous system. Their job is to transmit afferent nerve impulses from effector sites to the brain, right? Or spinal cord. I mentioned or spinal cord because there are like simple reflexes, for instance, which if there's ever like, actually, when I cut my finger, that's a really good example. That is such a intense thing to have happen. Like that's such a serious response that chances are my spine actually made that decision to pull my hand away before my brain even got to think about it. And then my brain had a chance to kind of interpret that information afterwards. Whenever you get hit with like a really like something that like triggers really intense neurological reactions, your nervous system actually doesn't take the time to send the information up to the brain. It'll get to your spinal cord, and then your spinal cord will just instantly send out the most simple response. That's why we call those simple reflexes. For instance, when you, like, if I throw my arm up really fast like this, and it naturally wants to bounce back in the other direction, I stretched out my arm so quickly that like my nervous system panics a little bit and actually contracts me back in the opposite direction. That's what's happening when you do like the knee test, right? When you like bang that patellar tendon and your knee kicks forward, that's because it's a spinal reflex. It's super simple. So it's just, it's like, I don't know, what do we do? We're overstretched. Contract, you know, like really, really simple. So sensory neurons transmit impulses from effector sites, such as like a muscle or a gland or whatever, to the brain, right? So if that gland gets poked, right, information goes to the brain. If that muscle gets stretched, information goes to the brain, right? So that is what we call an afferent neuron, right? Afferent neurons. They are affected by outside sources, okay? And then, and so again, they go, like we'll say, from, so we'll do an example here. A muscle senses that it is lengthened and sends that information to the brain. So a muscle realizes that it's stretched. Well, you know what, we'll say that. We'll say, no, that's fine. Then you have got motor neurons, which are exactly the opposite, right? So motor neurons' job is to, like, once your brain interprets all that information and it sends it back in the other direction, Motor neurons are in charge of like, you know, if that muscle is supposed to like, it goes, whoa, that's way too lengthened, shorten it, right? Motor neurons are going to trigger that shortening response. So they are going to transmit efferent, or efferent if you want to say that, nerve impulses. Oh, you know what? I wanted to, that's not how I want to capitalize. From effector sites, I want all that capitalized. Effector sites to the brain. That's how I do this. Sorry, I forgot how I normally do these notes. From sites to the brain. And then motor neurons go from the brain to sites. So they transmit nerve impulses from the brain to the effector sites, such as muscles or organs, right? So these are what we call efferent neurons, which is always like the worst, right? Afferent versus efferent. But efferent neurons, they have an effect on outside stuff, right? So like, you know, if you think of like being affected by something, well, or you have an effect on something, right? Like I am affected by the cold, but at the same time, if I step into a small room, the temperature of that room is going to go up. My body heat is having an effect, right? I'm effecting something rather than being affected by something. Welcome back to English class. So that's your afferent versus efferent neurons. Basically, sensory neurons gather information, motor neurons execute the response. A muscle contracts in response to being over lengthened. And then obviously we've got to be able to get information from the brain to these sites or from these sites to the brain. So we have interneurons that are all the ones in between. So interneurons are going to transmit nerve impulses from one neuron to another, right? So these are, you know, providing the link from one neuron in the foot to the neurons all the way up in the brain. You know, that's a pretty long distance, right? Like being able to like make that information travel all the way, you know, from one place to another. That's why you have interneurons. So everybody pretty good on all that? Everybody got feeling pretty good about neurons?
Yes, sir.
Awesome, awesome.
Yep.
Awesome, possum. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our divisions again here. You've got your central nervous system, right? That is the brain and the spinal cord. It's the command center, right? It's really in charge of everything. Then you get your peripheral nervous system, which is kind of like the workers, right? Like that's responsible for gathering and executing responses, right? Like your brain can't actually, you know, it's not directly attached to your bicep. It wants you to squeeze your bicep. So it has to be able to get that down from the spinal cord, and then it has to have all those peripheral nerves in the PNS to be able to actually get all the way over to the arm there. So that's sort of the main division there. Now, your peripheral nervous system is going to divide into a couple different sections here. So actually, I'm going to pull up a chart of this. Divisions of the nervous system. Do I like the way this looks? Yes, I do. Although it's kind of it's not bad. Okay, so this will work kind of well. I usually draw a chart for this on the whiteboard, and I don't have a whiteboard. So your nervous system, right, again, is divided into two main sections. Your central nervous system, right, that's your brain and your spinal cord. And then your peripheral nervous system, which is going to be divided. Oh, no, it's got divisions here. Nope, no. Don't pay attention to this one. This one's not bad. It's just more advanced than I want it to be. I want the simpler one. I don't need to see vision and all that stuff. I just need the divisions. There we go. Okay, this one. Okay, so so central is going to divide into. Oh, I did it again. Just don't pay attention to these divisions here. Just go straight down to two primary divisions. One is your somatic, that's your voluntary system, and the other is your autonomic, which is your involuntary system. So if we look at the divisions of the nervous system here. So you've got the central nervous system, right? That's going to be the brain and the spinal cord. Then you've got your peripheral, right? And that is going to be made up of two primary divisions here. You have got the autonomic and the somatic, right? So first one we're going to look at is the somatic, right? So you've got your somatic nervous system. This is responsible for conscious voluntary responses. Okay, so your somatic nervous system is in charge of like all the stuff you want to do. When you say you want to contract your bicep, that's your somatic nervous system that is like controlling that response, right? Me talking right now, that is my somatic nervous system. That is something that is happening under my voluntary control, okay? Primarily we think of this as like your skeletal muscle, right? You know, when you are controlling like the muscles that move your skeletal system around, that's all very voluntary for the most part. However, there are involuntary responses there. You know, if I poke this muscle really hard, right, like that kind of hurt a little bit, you know, I flinched, right? I like contracted my muscle, bunched up in order to kind of protect itself. That's a very involuntary response. So it's not that muscle is always voluntary. It certainly has involuntary function as well. It's just when we think of like our nervous system carrying stuff out, we have our conscious stuff and we have our unconscious stuff. And that's good. We want to have unconscious stuff, right? Like we don't want to have to think about every single action we do in a day. Like, oh, hey, like this cracker's a little dry. I better like make some more saliva, right? Like, we don't want to have to like continually think of every single little thing all the time. We want some of it to be automatic. And that is where our autonomic nervous system comes in. Autonomic, you can think of it as automatic, nervous system is responsible for involuntary automatic responses, right? So that is in charge of like, you know, doing all the stuff that we don't really need to actually think too much about every single day. Now that autonomic stuff is going to divide into two functions or two systems as well. So this is going to further pare down into your sympathetic, which is part of the peripheral because it's part of the autonomic, right? So this is part of this, which is part of this, right? So your sympathetic nervous system, that is your fight or flight system, right? This is the fight or flight nervous system. So it is responsible basically for freaking out. Your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for amping things up in response to usually like things like danger or stress, right? Like when you go to lift like a super heavy weight, right? Like let's say there's a barbell on the ground and you're gonna go do like a big heavy deadlift, and so you grab that barbell and you instantly start lifting, and the minute you get intention, you're like, oh, that's really heavy, right? Your body's gonna start sweating, your motor neurons are gonna get turned on like crazy. all of that is response to like fight or flight. Like that's your intense stuff. Now, and that's why maybe you do like 5 reps and you set that barbell down and you're shaking a little bit afterwards. That's because there's all kinds of things like adrenaline and stress hormones, and your nervous system is just firing. Like there's all this stuff coursing through your body, and so you're like next victim, let's do this. You know, like it's all turned on. It's in fight or flight mode. But when you leave the gym and like your heart rate starts to slow and your body calms down, you go into your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system. I'm gonna take the word nervous off. So that is responsible for like calming your body down, right? There's a reason you get a little groggy after eating, right? I mean, we've all experienced that like post-Thanksgiving, right? Like, you know, you had like a big feast, and now you're like, your body's like, all right, well, I'm going to take time to kind of digest everything. Let's go ahead and turn the skeletal muscle off. We're not really at any danger of like fighting any bears right now. Let's just go ahead and calm down and deal with all this turkey and mashed potatoes, right? Like it's calming you down. That's your rest and digest system. So you can kind of think of it as like your sympathetic nervous system sort of amps you up and your parasympathetic nervous system calms you down. So how's everybody feel about that so far? Pretty good?
Yeah, that was nice.
Cool. So the next section we've got are going to be your sensory receptors. So now if we are looking at that sensory information, right, we need to be able to talk about like how we gather that sensory information. And this is going to become really key when we get into assessments later, right? So sensory receptors, right, are going to be specialized receptors throughout the body that are responsible for transforming environmental stimuli into information for the brain to interpret. So basically, like, you know, if you stretch a muscle, right, that information needs to go into the brain. So your sensory receptors are going to gather that information and then send that information to the brain. And then the brain's going to go, oh man, that muscle's really stretched out. That's sensory receptors, right? So there's a lot of them. There's nociceptors. Nociceptors are, for the most part, pretty insensitive until they are triggered. And then once they're triggered, that tells your body, whoa, we are in pain, right? So if you have a high pain threshold or a high pain tolerance, you probably have less sensitive nociceptors than somebody who has a low pain tolerance. You get photoreceptors. Their job is to like sense light and like wavelengths. If you've ever had, I always think of it as like a silly conversation, but you hear people say like, how do I know your blue is the same as my blue? Like we could have 2 totally different blues. My blue could be your red. You don't know. Yes, we do. I don't mean to be a bummer, but we do know. We do know that your blue and my blue are slightly different, but we can measure the cones in our eyes. We can actually measure like the length of those cones. And so we know for the most part, they are about the same. However, yeah, yours and mine, slightly different, you know? If you're colorblind, you might be missing certain cones, you know? Depending on what type of colorblind you happen to be. So yes, your colors and mine might be slightly different, but it doesn't mean that your blue is my green. For the most part, they are about the same. So then we've got, those are photoreceptors. So there's a lot of different types of receptors that we've got throughout our body. For our relevance, we're gonna talk about mechanoreceptors. So mechanoreceptors are receptors, sensory receptors responsible for sensing mechanical, or you can think of it as like physical, changes in the environment, right? So that's going to be things like stretch, tension, acceleration, etc. Lots of things like that. There's lots of, those are mechanoreceptors. They sense stretch or tension or acceleration, whatever. The three main ones that we're going to have are muscle spindles, right? So muscle spindles are sensory receptors that are located throughout the belly of a muscle, responsible for sensing changes in muscular length and rate of length change. So muscle spindles, their job is to run the entire length of your muscle, and when your muscle becomes this long, it tells your, tells your brain how long the muscle is. It's basically a tape measure running throughout your entire muscle. Now, their other job isn't just to measure the length, they also measure the rate of length change. So if you change that length super quickly, your brain is more likely to panic because like the muscle spindle is going to go, whoa, we are lengthening at a super fast pace, right? I always think of it in my, this is the weird way that my brain works. My brain is like a movie. It's like, it's that person who runs into the captain's deck and they're like, we're losing fuel at this rate. And they're like, my God, we're not going to make it. Like, that's kind of like what a muscle spindle does when it freaks out. It's like, we're lengthening too fast, and so like, that is why sometimes like when we get like a stretch reflex, right? Like we take advantage of stretch shortening cycles, right? Remember, a stretch shortening cycle is when you overstretch a muscle and then it responds by shortening that same muscle in order to protect itself, right? So if I rapidly drop my hips down super fast like that, I'm going to experience a rapid lengthening of certain muscles, and my body's going to go, whoa, and it's going to tell me to jump, or it's going to shorten those muscles, which results in me jumping, rather, right? So like when I want to jump high, it's important for me to not jump like this, and then jump, right? What's important is for me to start in a tall position and throw my arms down and rapidly bounce. That rapid bouncing creates a stretch reflex. And a stretch reflex is because my muscle spindle freaked out. My muscle spindle was like, we're losing fuel too fast. No, it was like, we're losing length too fast. So those are your muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles are the ones that are usually lying to the brain. They're the ones that are often telling the brain, yeah, we're at full length right now. We can't stretch any further. And we know that's not true, right? If you have rounded shoulders, you have an overactive muscle spindle. You got a muscle spindle that's saying, yeah, we're at full length. We couldn't possibly stretch any further because it's trying to protect the muscle, right? A muscle that's in a shortened position is very protected, right? It's not at risk of being over pulled and over torn. But we do know that like, we have more length that muscle should be able to relax, right? If I have rounded shoulders because my pecs are basically shortening, right? And I'm stuck in this position here with this like, horizontal adduction, right? I need to be able to like get that to relax, to let this muscle lengthen out. So luckily we've got another sensory receptor that's responsible for sensing tension. And so those are our Golgi tendon organs. These are sensory receptors located in the tendon of a muscle that is responsible for sensing muscular tension and rate of tension changes. So again, same thing is happening here, right? If there's a lot of tension all of a sudden, your Golgi tendon organ is going to freak out. If there's tension very slowly, it's less likely to freak out. But it's in charge of like telling like, hey, there's lots of tension. Now, we take advantage of Golgi tendon organs in two different ways. Number one, we get the Golgi tendon organ to realize that there is very little tension. And then that will cause the muscle spindle to relax, because these two sensory receptors are supposed to work together, right? Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, they're working to give you your body proprioception, right? Remember proprioception, your body's understanding of where it is in space. If this muscle is at maximum length, right, it knows like this is about the full range of motion I've got in stretching my pec out. I can't really go much further than this, right? So my brain knows that I'm in that position because this muscle is being pulled apart. It's in its full length. right? And so my brain knows, oh, we must be in horizontal abduction, right? Meanwhile, other muscles are in different lengths. And so that information is coming to my brain. So your muscle spindles, your Golgi tendon organs, that's how your brain understands where it is in space. So now that I mentioned that overactive muscles are muscles that kind of stay in a shortened state, right? Like an overactive muscle is a muscle spindle that basically won't turn off. It's like, no, we're at full length now. We couldn't possibly stretch any further. Remember earlier how I mentioned some people just aren't aware of the fact they have an anterior pelvic tilt? Some people just aren't aware that their knees are caving in. Some people just aren't aware that their shoulders are elevated. We start to understand that that's an alteration in proprioception. That's an alteration in the body's ability to understand where it is in space. If my pelvis were tilted like this, but I feel like this is a neutral position, right? Like I feel like this is totally neutral, perfect posture. The reason for that is because the muscle spindles in my hip flexors are saying, no, we can't stretch any further. Yeah, we're at full length now. But then if I do some foam rolling and then some stretches, and that gets me back to a neutral position, right? Now my brain has a chance to alter its proprioception. It starts to realize, I totally could have stretched further. I totally had more room to stretch, right? And that's going to give, my muscles on the backside, right? With an anterior tilt, my hip flexors are really tight. Should do the side that you guys can see. My hip flexors are really tight over here, and my glute muscles, which are supposed to like help me tilt back the other way, they're really loose, right? They're basically not turned on as much as they should be. And so, I need to deactivate those overactive muscle spindles. And luckily, I can use Golgi tendon organs to do that. I can put pressure on a Golgi tendon organ, which is responsible for it sensing tension, right? So it starts to go, whoa, all of a sudden there's a lot of tension, right? Now your body has two responses. After about 30 seconds, it can realize that there actually is no tension. And then that gives your brain the ability to like, wait, there's no tension? If there's no tension, that means that there's no length. If there's no length, that means that the muscle spindle's lying, right? And then it can cause it to relax. And that'll allow you to get back to a neutral, like full postured position. Or a Golgi tendon organ can get to such a high degree of tension that it goes, if I experience any more tension, this muscle is going to tear off the bone. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the muscle completely off. And so then it will deactivate the muscle, causing it to relax. And then, now you can stretch a little bit further and have more length. That is what we call autogenic inhibition. When we put pressure on a Golgi tendon organ and it tells a muscle spindle to relax, that's autogenic inhibition, right? That is a muscle spindle saying, look, if we keep holding on to all this like tension, and if this muscle spindle stays like shortened rather than lengthened, the muscle is going to rip off the bone. So let's turn everything off and allow that, extra length to occur. And then lastly, we do also have joint receptors. And these are sensory receptors located in the joints that are responsible for sensing pressure, acceleration, and deceleration of joints. So, when we talk about muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, we're mostly talking about like the muscle. This is located like your joint receptors. There's a lot of different types of them, but they're basically in this delicate structures found in your joints. And so when your joints get really close together, they're responsible for sensing like what length that. That's why like if you're having trouble cracking your knuckles and you push even harder and all of a sudden it kind of hurts your joints, right? Those are your joint receptors that are responsible for that. That's very similar to like, that pain of pushing your joints too close together, very similar to the category of pain that like your muscles create when you're stretching and you're like, you're stretching like crazy. That's a protective mechanism to get you to stop cramming your joints or stop lengthening your muscles. So we do know that your clients are going to obviously improve when you start training them. But one cool thing about the nervous system is that like most of those early stage improvements, particularly like in the stabilization phase, most of the reason why people are able to lift heavy, it's not because like, from week 1 to week 2, they all of a sudden gain 10 pounds of muscle. It's just that their nervous system knows how to control the body. So that's where a lot of your early stage improvements are going to come from. Do you guys have any questions about the nervous system? That's pretty much the nervous system in a nutshell. At least, obviously there's more, and we talked about more in other classes, but that's the stuff that's relevant for 101. Any questions or comments? Nope.
No.
Cool. Moving on. Let's look at the bones. So all the way back to the top here, we're looking at our skeletal system next. So the skeletal system. So this is also going to be kind of divided, right? If we look at our divisions of the skeletal system, you're going to see two primary divisions here. You're going to see the brain and your spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord. Good Lord. Your skull and your vertebral column and rib cage, which is where that central is located. And then you're going to see your appendicular skeleton, which is going to be like your arms and legs. Okay, so you're going to see the axial skeleton. My brain just went on autopilot. The brain and the spinal cord. That's going to be the skull, rib cage, and vertebral column, right? And then your appendicular skeleton, which is your appendages, right? So that is going to be the upper and lower, well, actually, we'll do the shoulder girdle and arms, as well as the pelvic girdle and legs. There we go. So appendicular skeleton, arms and legs, axial skeleton, all the stuff in the center. So those are sort of our divisions here. Now, one of the biggest things that we talk about when it comes to the skeletal system is we talk about like bone growth. However, we spent a lot of time talking about bone growth in kinesiology because that was related to like how we train the body to sort of trigger that bone growth, right? That's a really important thing when we talk about like seniors, right? We want to trigger bone growth. We want to keep their bone density as high as possible.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, absolutely, right? Like I know that like, low bone density runs in certain parts of my family because like we have high bone density in other parts of our body, My body loves to put all its extra calcium on my frickin' spinal column. I'd rather have it on my femur, So that is very much like how we talk about bone growth. So the cells that are responsible for that are going to be called your osteoblasts and your osteoclasts. Now, the only reason I'm not going to put these actually in our notes today, they are in the PowerPoint here, but they are not a concept related to like assessing. Like we don't assess our clients for how active their bone density is. That's going to require like a bone density test, which is really much more administered by like a doctor. Now we can talk about bone density, but that's a little more relevant to like our kinesiology mod, a little bit more relevant to our physiology mod. So I'm going to mention it here just because it is in the chapter, and then we're going to kind of move past it. I'm not going to put it in our notes today. So osteoclasts, they are your bone breaker downers, right? Osteoclasts are responsible for eating up old bone tissue. Or imperfect bone tissue. Don't think of it just as the old stuff, but also like imperfect stuff. So, when you exercise, right? Like let's go back to that deadlift that I did earlier, right? I'm doing that big, heavy deadlift, right? My bones are flexing, like they're, my muscles are pulling on those bones, causing like, them to work against gravity. And in this case, like a lot of gravity, right? So what's happening is like, because my bones are kind of bending, right? And we can even see that, if I grab this like kettlebell here, right? And I raise this up, into this position. If I do like an upright row here, right? Look at my arm here, right? Like this arm is being pulled out to the side like that. So what that is right? When it's going this way, like the deltoid muscle runs over top and inserts right up here. It's pulling from here, which means all the rest part of that bone is basically just like working directly against gravity. It's experiencing this kind of, bending sensation. I got my hangers right here. This will be perfect. Kind of looks like this, right? Now, that's a piece of plastic, so it's all pretty much like, designed to kind of flex and stretch and stuff. But your bones are hard tissue. They're made up of like calcium, and there's this like kind of honeycomb shape. So when they experience like that flexing and that torquing, they experience these little tiny microfractures in that honeycomb. And so those little microfractures mean that the density is compromised. So what's going to happen is your osteoclasts are going to come along and they're going to eat away that old bone tissue. A lot of times we think of like osteoclasts as the bad guys, but like we wouldn't be able to trigger the next part of growth if it wasn't for eating that old bone tissue away. Plus, I don't want compromised bone tissue. I want structurally sound bone tissue. So now what's going to happen is my osteoblasts, which are my bone builder uppers, they're going to come along and they're going to lay down this kind of wet, gooey mixture of like collagen that has all these like really cool little ions in it that absorb calcium. And so now all that calcium that was eaten up by the osteoclasts is going to come back down and reform new bone tissue. Meanwhile, I'm continuing like my eating every day and having a healthy diet that has calcium in it. So any extra calcium is also going to get laid down. And what's going to happen is I'm going to increase my bone density. So we call that whole process bone remodeling. It is where osteoclasts break down old bone tissue and osteoblasts build up new bone tissue. So types of bones that we've got, we do have long bones, right? Long bones are long in nature. I know, sounds, you wouldn't believe it. But they are longer than they are shorter, right? That's their kind of defining characteristic. Your femur, which happens to be like the longest bone in your body, right? Your humerus, that's a long bone, but also like the carpals in your palm, right? I'm sorry, your metacarpals in your palm. Those are long bones as well. The digits, right? Those are all carpals. Those are all long bones. They're long in nature. You've also got short bones, which are usually sometimes referred to as like cuboid bones. But these are like very cubical in shape. The carpals in your wrist, for instance, I need to be able to like move this in a lot of different ranges of motion. So I need to have those, cubes be able to go this way and this way. I need to be able to have them like slide around. My long bones, I really want them just to provide like these big long levers. Then you got flat bones, which are really thin and kind of protective, right? So your scapula is a really good example of that. This allows like a lot of like fan-shaped, like wide muscles to be able to grab and pull from a lot of different angles. And then you've got unique bones or irregular bones, right? Irregular bones are oddly shaped bones that have a very unique function. Your spine is a really good example of this. We can see a bunch of different spinal processes here. They're very good at having these joints that are called facet joints that allow them to kind of lock into each other to provide stability, but at the same time, they also have the ability to kind of move side to side, and they can rotate a little bit. So, those are sort of the main categories of bones here, right? Now, when we talk about our bone markings, these are some of the things we mentioned briefly in kinesiology. This is what allow, your bone markings, the unique markings that they have, allow your muscles to have something to grip onto. I always picture like a rock climbing wall in my head, it allows like you to get a good grip when you're climbing up that wall. That's what like depressions and processes are, So when you're doing like a rock climbing wall, sometimes you'll see the dented ones where you kind of dig your fingers in, right? Those are depressions, right? But at the same time, you'll see like the bumpy ones that you just kind of have to grip and hold on to. Those are like processes. So depressions are flattened or indented portions found in your skeletal system, and processes are projections from the bones. All of those bone markings are going to give your muscles something to attach onto. Then if we look at our vertebral column, right, this is a big part of our skeletal system that's obviously very important to us. We have all of your lumbar vertebrae, right? We've got your thoracic vertebrae and your cervical vertebrae. And then at the bottom, you have your sacrum and your coccyx, right? Your sacrum, that little triangle-shaped bone at the very bottom, that's sometimes referred to as like, you know, the top of your tailbone. That is what allows the two pelvic bones to have something to grip onto. And that allows them to be able to rotate slightly or elevate slightly side to side. And then obviously it allows them to work together to create this movement as well. So that is your sacroiliac joint, right? It's where your sacrum comes together with the two parts of your pelvis, which are called your iliums. So if that gets really tight, you know, you're gonna have like rotational problems. I'm having a little bit of like problem, you know, this sedentary world that we're living in right now. I'm having a little bit of like SI joint like dysfunction. So I'm noticing like sometimes when I do certain squatting motions, I feel this pulling in my sacrum there. And it just means I need to do some stretches that I'm not normally throwing into my routine. So then we have our joints. So if we're looking at like the skeletal system, right, we have our, I'm gonna put bones in here, even though bones. So we kind of covered. So bones act as levers for the muscular system to manipulate, right? So by providing long levers for muscles to attach to, bones can be manipulated to produce human movement. That sounds okay, good. That's very similar to my car alarm. And I've had my car stolen twice, so I'm a little paranoid. Bones are going to provide you with the levers for you to actually kind of move things around, right? They're going to kind of come together. Then you've got your joints, which are the meeting place of bone. We won't say meeting place, we'll say the articulation of two or more bones coming together, right? And we've got a couple different types of joints here. We're gonna have rolling joints, sliding joints, and spinning joints. So rolling joints literally are going to roll from one surface to another, right? Your femur rolling over your tibia, right? That's a really good example, right? Your elbow rolling, right? So when a bone has like that round shape to the end and it rolls like this, right? That's very much like a rolling joint. But there's also sliding motions that happen as well. We were just talking about like the carpals of the wrist, right? Those are two cuboid shaped bones that can slide this way, they can slide this way, right? They can do all that sliding motion. And then we also have like a spinning motion, right? Like where two bones might sit onto each other and they're also, your spine's a really good example of that spinning motion, right? So these are kind of the typical joint motions that we're gonna see. So two or more bones coming together. Now in your joints, you are gonna have specialized structures, right? You're going to have things, you're gonna see synovial joints. Actually, we'll do non-synovial first. Non-synovial joints are joints that are articulations that do not have a joint cavity. They are held together with fibrous connective tissue. Okay, so like they experience little to no movement. Okay, so they're gonna not experience like a lot of movement here. So like the sutures of your skull, for instance, you know, yes, there are technically more than one. There's a lot of different bones coming together in the top of your skull, but we kind of think of it as all just like one big, you know, circular bone. Technically, it's multiple bones, but they don't really act like multiple bones. You know, they're not really designed to be able to move very much. So that's a non-synovial joint. Your two pelvic bones coming together, right? Like where the two parts of my ilium connect in what is called my pubis symphysis, that is not designed to like move, right? It can move a little, right? My pelvis can do a little bit of rotary movement. It can kind of tilt side to side like this, but it's not really designed to do that much movement. There's a benefit to that. Little movement means lots of stability, right? You know, the more something moves, the more unstable it is, which means it's more likely prone to things like dislocation. So that's where we've got our synovial joints. And these are the ones we're primarily going to spend our time talking about. So synovial joints are articulations that have specialized structures and have a joint, actually, hold on. They have a joint cavity and specialized structures to allow for greater movement. Okay, so your synovial joints are, you know, 80% of the joints in your body are synovial. They have things like synovial fluid, which is this kind of viscous, it kind of looks like egg whites actually, egg white looking material that is designed to allow for the decrease of friction between bones. So it's literally like, it's kind of like the oil in your car, you know, like it's there to make sure that like sliding happens and it doesn't like overcook your joints. We are also going to see things like ligaments. This is going to be a really big one. I'm actually going to fold that. Ligaments, which are structures that connect bone to bone. So like your anterior cruciate ligament that attaches your femur to your tibia, right? Like all the ligaments in your knee. So those are definitely like a very important special structure. You're also going to see things like cartilage, which is going to be smooth tissue designed to decrease friction. And then we're also going to see things like fat pads sometimes, bursa, and other materials. So there are some other materials in there as well that we're not going to go quite as in depth into. But again, the reason we're talking about this, right? The reason we're talking about synovial fluid and ligaments and cartilage is because like when somebody's body is sitting at the wrong posture, right? They're more likely to grind that cartilage. Once that cartilage disappears, now they're grinding bone on bone, so they're going to experience joint pain. That's what we're talking about when we talk about arthritis from last mod, right? Osteoarthritis is just a gradual wear down, and a lot of times it's caused by poor posture. So when we look at the function of our joints, again, they are the means of like allowing us to manipulate our skeletal system, but they also provide us with like stability, right? Like we have like our non-synovial joints. Those are very stable joints that, you know, are going to hold together really well. Our synovial joints are less stable, but they allow us to have greater movement. So, you know, there's kind of a trade-off there. We want to have good, you know, connective tissue, and we want to have like, you know, lots of space between our joints, but we do have to be aware that like without proper strength, that increased mobility comes decreased stability. So eventually you end up moving your joint too much, and that can cause, you know, all kinds of other types of pains. So ligaments, we kind of already covered, but they are connective tissue that that has like, I'm actually going to move this down to the bottom because then it'll make this next part of the notes a little easier, like that. So ligaments, structures to connect bone to bone. Now, one thing we need to be aware of that I forgot to put before, they are characterized by limited blood flow. And because of that, they are going to repair slowly, right? So that's one thing about tendons and ligaments. They just don't have as many blood vessels traveling to them, so they don't get as much blood flow, which means that they're not getting as many nutrients delivered, which means the cells that, you know, move those ligaments do not repair as quickly. So this is kind of a fun little thing to debunk. We've all at some point heard of the dangers of steroids, right? And sometimes you'll hear people say, like, I remember when I was younger, I remember being told this in like gym class when I was a little kid. being like, hey, you know, one of the big issues with steroids is it strengthens your muscle tissue, but does not strengthen your connective tissue. And you will sometimes like see stuff like that. You'll see like these, you know, super intense, you know, on steroid like lifters, and they'll be lifting, and then all of a sudden like their tendon will just give out, and so their muscle will just detach from the bone, and oftentimes you'll see it like pull up. This is one of the reasons, by the way, I'm doing a side note, but I'm gonna do another side note on a side note. This side note wears a hat. One of the reasons I actually really don't care for a mixed grip deadlift, like I think it can be a helpful tool. Trust me, if you do a mixed grip, you will be able to lift more. It makes your grip way better. I prefer just a standard grip when it comes to the deadlift. If I am doing like maximum strength lifting. And people always go, why don't you do the mixed grip? It'll totally help with your grip. It does help, it really does. But it's external rotation of my arm, which means that my bicep is in a further stretched position, and I'm being pulled down to the ground with this big heavy weight. And I have seen way too many horror stories of what we like a bicep tendon tear, where basically like somebody's bicep just detaches from their arm because it's just being pulled too far away. And you're already in a mixed grip, which means you're in like a super lengthened position. So me personally, I really don't care for the mixed grip. At least if I'm lifting really heavy. I don't care if it's a low intensity and you're doing a high number of reps and you just want to do mixed grips so you don't have to deal with like the endurance burning in your forearm. I think that's fine, but I definitely don't care for it in other ways. So anyway, a lot of times you'll hear people say like steroids don't strengthen your connective tissue. That's not necessarily true. Like steroids grow pretty much everything. But they are going to be proportional compared to the blood flow. So, you know, if there's more blood flow going to your muscles and you start taking steroids and your muscles get super strong super rapidly, your connective tissue, which is getting stronger, it's not getting stronger at the same rate because it's not getting so much blood flow. So, you know, it's almost like compound interest, right? Like if you have, we're going to use numbers because they're kind of easier to understand. If you have $10 in one account and $5 in another, and you increase both of them by 10%, right? Well, that 10 just became 11 and that 5 just became 550, which meant that like one of them got twice as large as the other one did, right? That is sort of what we see there. With like steroids and stuff. So it's not that it doesn't strengthen connective tissues, it just doesn't strengthen it as quickly because there's limited blood flow. So I'm really just kind of using that as an analogy. Hopefully you guys will remember ligaments don't get as much blood flow. That's actually the important thing to remember. So positive effects of exercise. Again, I'm not going to put this quite in our notes today because it's not related directly to like assessing, but weight-bearing exercise in particular, exercises that work against gravity have been shown to be very, very good for our skeletal system. Running, weightlifting, calisthenics is weightlifting, anything that works directly against gravity are really good examples of ways to increase bone density. Swimming and cycling, while those are absolutely fantastic forms of exercise, have not been shown to have quite the positive effects on bone density. They're good for other reasons, but if your priority is like bone density, you're primarily going to want to focus on weight-bearing exercises. So to kind of summarize everything up today, we have got 3 systems. We talked about 2 of them. We talked about our nervous system and our skeletal system. Tomorrow we'll look at the muscular system, which obviously is a big part of assessments. Then we'll get our homework 2 out tomorrow. So kinetic chain is going to be the big focus for homework 1. I say homework 2? Homework 1. Your nervous system is billions of neurons that are in charge of like sensing information and interpreting that information and then executing the appropriate responses. And your skeletal system is there to provide like a framework, you know? If your nervous system is functioning improperly and maybe causing a muscle to pull more than it's supposed to, because maybe a certain part of your nervous system has been deactivated and another part of your nervous system has become overactivated, it's going to alter how your joints are able to like move and manipulate your body. So now you might start experiencing things like pain and a gradual wear down of that skeletal system. So these systems are certainly linked. Your nervous system is not really controlling your skeletal system, but it is certainly, your skeletal system is certainly affected by it. And then, if your bones sit in a way that they're not supposed to sit, your body's not going to be able to move the way it's supposed to move. So your nervous system is going to move a different way. Now your skeletal system structure is directly affecting how your nervous system is controlled. So again, it's all a big link, right? If one of them is out of whack, all of them are out of whack. So any questions for today? How you guys feeling about day one, PFT 101?
Another good day.
Pretty good?
Another very informative day.
All right. And Maggie, do you start to see like the circular nature of Sochi? Oh, yeah. Any of that stuff you might have been worried about before? It's like, I promise you're going to get, whack, we're going to hit you with it. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to let you go. We'll get this up online. I got to come up with a new color. I'm running out of colors. We've used yellow for our thumbnails, purple and red, and we might start getting rainbow. First world problems. All right. So yeah, we will see you guys tomorrow, and hopefully we'll get a new student or two joining us.
I have a quick question when this is all done.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me. I'll end the recording.